What are the best camera settings for shooting with your GoPro? Stay tuned and I'll tell you. Hey friends, welcome back to the studio. This is Susie with Gemini Connect. This is probably one of our most requested videos because if you're not familiar, my partner Martin and I have been shooting with our GoPros ever since the GoPro Hero 7, and we shoot a lot of our vlogs and travel videos with this camera setup. This is our exact GoPro vlogging setup right here, along with the two external microphones that we use. We'll also be talking about what settings to have if you're using an external microphone. If you'd like to see any of our sample travel videos that we shoot with GoPro, then check out our second vlogging channel, Gemini Discover. Pretty much every single video on that channel was shot with a GoPro. So in the most recent GoPros, including the Hero 8 and the Hero 9, you can now save your different settings in presets. And this just makes it a lot easier to flip between shooting like a vlogging video or a cinematic video or a slow-mo or action video. So this video I'm going to be talking about the different presets that we have. There are 4 presets in particular, one for vlogging, another for cinematic, a third for action or activity, and a fourth for slow-mo. So let's start with the settings that are the same no matter which preset we're using. Number 1, we leave scheduled capture off. Scheduled capture is a new feature that debuted on the Hero 9, and it's really great in theory, but we just don't use it a lot in our everyday shooting. Scheduled capture basically lets you time in advance when you're going to start shooting with the camera. It's really great for like time lapses, but for vlogging or cinematic video or just anything that's not time lapse or time related, it's not really relevant. Next, let's go down to ProTune. The first thing that's constant between all of our settings is the bitrate. We leave this on high. The higher the bitrate, the higher quality your video will be, but the larger your file will be. Next, we leave sharpness in medium. We sometimes go down to low sharpness. We did that a lot with the Hero 7 and the Hero 8, but with the Hero 9, low sharpness is a little too low. So our videos end up looking out of focus or kind of fuzzy. So for that reason, we now shoot in medium sharpness on the Hero 9. I would never shoot in high sharpness on this camera. I find that a lot of the budget cameras and smaller cameras tend to overdo the sharpness. So your image looks a little too cartoony or just unreal. So I don't think it's a good idea to shoot in high sharpness, but medium is a pretty good compromise. Next is white balance. Leave the white balance on auto. I just never find a reason to switch that white balance. The only time you might want to manually toggle that is if you're in an indoor setting. I think if you're shooting outdoors in natural lighting, the GoPro does a really good job with white balance, but it can get a little confused if you're shooting indoors with unnatural lighting. Next, raw audio. We leave this on off. We used to shoot with raw audio on, but that generates a secondary audio file that you then have to sync and do post-production with later. If you are really hardcore about your audio, then you might want to leave this on, but just be aware that it does produce a secondary file that you have to tinker with and sync later in post-production. Next is color. We leave this on GoPro Color. Now, some people in the past have said that GoPro colors don't look good, they look kind of fake or unnatural, but we've been using the GoPro since the Hero 7, and we're actually pretty happy with GoPro colors. We think it was the very best on the Hero 8. Some say that that color was a little too warm, but we personally like our colors to be on the warmer side anyway. So color, I think, is just a matter of taste. You may want to leave it on GoPro Color, or you might want to choose flat. Just be aware though that if you choose flat, you have to do post-production on your video, otherwise your video is going to look very unsaturated and it won't have really any color to it. The next setting is wind. This refers to audio, and we leave this on auto. So when it's on auto, whenever the GoPro detects wind hitting its microphones, it applies a wind reduction. And so this can make your sound a little bit uneven, but it does block out the otherwise really awful wind noise that you would get instead. So again, kind of a compromise, but for us, we prefer having our wind reduction on. So the last setting that we leave constant is the ISO minimum, which we leave at 100, and the ISO maximum, which we leave at 1600. So ISO refers to the light sensitivity of your camera, and so the higher the ISO limit that you set, the more your GoPro is able to shoot in low lighting. You can actually have your ISO maximum up to 6400, but that's pretty high, and I don't even shoot in ISO 6400 on a lot of my mirrorless cameras. The reason is, even though you can shoot in low lighting, it adds a lot of noise and just really degrades the overall quality of your image. So it is a matter of taste, but I like to leave my ISO max at 1600, maybe ISO 3200 if I'm shooting in a really dark space. But if you're shooting in darkness, I think rather than degrading your quality with a higher ISO max, you might as well just add an external light, and that really helps you shoot in low lighting. It is also worth noting that the GoPros have never been very good at shooting in low lighting without an external light, so your expectations should be pretty low in terms of low light shooting with this camera. Next, let's talk about the settings you should have if you're using external microphones. So if you want to use an external microphone with GoPro, you do have to get a secondary accessory. That can be either the official GoPro mic adapter or the GoPro Media Mod. But the reason is the attachment that you use to plug in the external microphone to the camera is not present on a GoPro without one of those two accessories. And that is the 3.5mm mic jack. So the two external microphones that we like to use a lot when we're vlogging with the GoPro are the DD4 Duo. That's because this microphone is able to pick up sound on both the front and the back of the microphone. And also the Rode Wireless Go 2, or the original Rode Wireless Go. And the Rode Wireless Go is great because you're able to put the receiver on top of the camera and clip the microphone to yourself, and then you can be far away from your camera and still be able to record your audio. Whenever you're shooting with an external microphone with your GoPro, you do have to go into the preferences and select certain microphone settings. If you're using a microphone such as the DD4 Duo or the Rode Video Micro or just a standard shotgun microphone that does not have its own battery power, then select standard microphone. But if you're using a microphone that has to be charged, such as the Rode Wireless Go or any other microphones that have their own battery inside of them, then make sure that you select powered microphone. If you're not using an external microphone, then you don't have to worry about this step at all. Now let's get into our very first preset, which is our standard vlogging preset. So this is what we shoot in most of the time, and the very first setting is the resolution. So we always shoot in 4K 30 frames per second. The GoPro Hero 9 is able to shoot in up to 5K, but we personally don't shoot in 5K, mainly because we don't want to deal with editing super large files. If you do shoot in 5K and even 4K, you want to make sure to have a computer that is able to process those types of files and also a high internet speed in order to upload those files. Just be aware that 4K and 5K files are really big, and you're going to want a lot of computing power if you plan to edit your videos. Speaking of editing, it's also important to mind your import and export settings on your video editing software, because this can also affect the quality of your overall video. We personally shoot in 4K 30, but we edit in 4K 24. And the reason is, if you're shooting in 4K 30, then we're able to slow down that footage by about 20% if we're editing in 24 frames per second. So that just gives us a little bit of leeway if we ever want to add a little bit of slow-mo to some of our footage without sacrificing frames or quality. The next setting is hyper smooth. We leave this on boost most of the time because that gives us the most stable video quality, but it does crop into your frame a little bit. So we sometimes also shoot in hyper smooth high because it still gives us some stability but less of a crop. For hindsight, we'll leave this feature off. This is a new feature that came out in the Hero 9, and it basically allows you to capture about 15 to 30 seconds ahead of when you press the start button. So this is more useful for some of the other settings later, but for vlogging, we're very intentional when we start recording, so we don't find the need to have 15 to 30 seconds of extra footage before we start recording. For the lens, we leave this on linear plus horizon leveling. Horizon leveling is new on the Hero 9, and this basically lets you shoot in linear, so you eliminate that fisheye look, but it keeps your horizon level. So even if you're shooting at an angle, your footage will still look like it's straight on. And so this is a really great feature that we absolutely love about the Hero 9. But we sometimes also shoot in wide or super view, depending on the footage, because when you're vlogging, sometimes you want to look more cinematic without that fisheye effect, and other times you want that fisheye effect, especially if you're shooting in a super cool place, you want to show off more of the scenery around you, or if you have 2 or 3 people in your shot, it's sometimes a lot easier to shoot wider. The next setting is shutter speed. We leave this on auto, and I'll talk more about shutter speed and when to take it off of auto in the cinematic presets. But for now, leave it on auto and it's just a lot easier to film. And the final setting is EV. We leave this on 0. Our next preset is activity, and we use this for action. Our resolution for action is 4K 60 frames per second. So you can shoot in 4K 60, which is considered a pretty high resolution and frame rate. But we do find that whenever you're shooting in 4K 60, it overheats the camera more, takes up more storage space on your memory card, and also is really hard on your computer when you're trying to edit. So that's why we don't shoot in 4K 60 all of the time. But we'll do that when we're shooting action, because if you're shooting in 4K 60, you're able to slow down your footage quite a bit without shooting in slow-mo. For hyper smooth, we leave it on boost because we want the maximum stability whenever we're going really fast and doing a lot of action. We don't mind sacrificing a little bit of image crop. Next is hindsight, and we do leave this feature on for activity because sometimes you can't always predict when the action is going to happen, so it's really handy to be able to press record and be like, oops, I kind of missed some of the action. So if you have hindsight enabled, then you're able to capture 15 or 30 seconds prior to when you hit the record button. For the lens, we typically leave it on linear with horizon leveling, mainly for that reason of we're shooting action, we can't always worry about leaving the camera level, so having the horizon leveling on automatically levels out your frame no matter how twisted your camera is. But sometimes we do go to wide or super view, again depending on the scene and how much of the scene we want to capture in our lens. Next is shutter speed, and again we leave this on auto, and the EV comp is left at 0. The next preset is cinematic, and this is where the settings can get a little bit more interesting. First of all is resolution, that is 4K 30, hyper smooth is on boost or high depending on what kind of crop we want, and hindsight is off. For lens, we almost always leave it on linear. For cinematic shooting, we don't really want that fisheye effect, so we almost never shoot wide or super view when shooting in cinematic. Next is shutter speed, and this is the only preset where the shutter speed is not set to auto. We manually set the shutter speed, and that's because if you're shooting cinematic footage, then technically your shutter speed should be double that of your frame rate. So because we're shooting in 4K 30 frames per second, we want our shutter speed to be 1/60th of a second. If you're shooting in 4K 24, then your shutter speed should be at 1/50th, or at 4K 60, it should be at 1/20th of a second. The only problem with manually setting your shutter speed is that if you do that and just try to shoot normally with your GoPro without adding any extra accessories, then you might find that your exposure is really off. If you're out shooting in daylight, then your picture is going to be really blown out. Or if you're shooting somewhere without enough lighting, then your picture quality is going to be really dark. If you're shooting with your shutter speed on auto, then your camera is able to adjust the shutter speed depending on the light conditions. But if you fix your shutter speed at a set rate, then you have to help your camera out if you're ever changing the lighting conditions. So there are 2 extra accessories that I recommend having if you plan to shoot cinematic footage with your shutter speed at a fixed rate. The first are ND filters. These in particular are by Telesin, but there are also ND filters available by other brands such as Polar Pro and Freewell. I have another video going more in depth about ND filters if you want to learn more about why you need them, but as a basic summary, ND filters are these filters that replace the front filter of your GoPro, or in the case of Telesin, they just pop right on top. But the ND filters come in different strengths, and you want to use the ND filter that will help you balance out your light condition if you're shooting at a fixed shutter speed. The other accessory that I recommend using along with your GoPro when you're shooting cinematic is a gimbal. This is the Moza Mini P, and this is our favorite gimbal for using with the GoPro, mainly because you can also stick a smartphone or even a smaller DSLR or mirrorless camera on this gimbal. And the reason why you would need a gimbal is that, again, if you're setting your shutter speed at something like 1/50th or 1/60th of a second, then your footage is going to end up being pretty shaky and not very stable. It basically overrides hypersmooth when you set your shutter speed like that. So it's really hard to get stable footage if you don't have a gimbal. So adding a gimbal allows you to get more stable footage even when you manually set your shutter speed. The last two settings in the cinematic preset are EV comp, which we leave at 0, and color, which we might switch to flat. Cinematic shooting is basically the only time that we'll ever take our color off of GoPro color and shoot in flat instead. And that's because shooting in flat gives you more flexibility in post-production. The fourth and final preset is slow-mo. If you're not already familiar, slow-mo has a lot to do with your frame rate or your frames per second. The GoPro Hero 9 is now able to shoot at 120 frames per second in 2.7K resolution. Or it can do 240 frames per second, which is ultra slow motion, but only in 1080p. For us, we always value higher resolution, so we leave ours at 2.7K at 120 frames per second. The lens is linear with horizon leveling because, again, we like our horizon to be steady and not have to fix that in post-production, and our shutter speed is set to auto. EV comp is at 0, GoPro color is usually on, and we don't bother with the hindsight for slow-mo. Alright, so those are the 4 major presets that we use all the time whenever we're filming with our GoPro Hero 9. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Again, if you want to see any sample footage of us shooting with GoPro using those various settings, you can check out our second vlog channel, which is called Gemini Discover. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or other comments about the GoPro, and thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.